just off the road that winds through the Trough of Bowland. If you follow the brook by the public footpath into the bleak Langden Valley, according to the Ordnance Survey map, there stands Langden Castle, open brackets, ruins, close brackets. We like a bit of tumble-down Gothic architecture at Lancashire Footnotes, especially when it's buried deep in the sort of mountainous terrain that plays havoc with Jeannie Mackintosh's varicose veins, and has battlements and castellations and idiotic aristocratic folklore behind it. So we pulled on our hiking boots, had Jeannie Mackintosh's suspension checked because you don't want your Zimmer frame buggering up halfway down a fell, drove to the designated parking spot. You can't just park anywhere in the Trough of Bowland unless you want your wing mirrors eaten by wild sheep, and made our way to the legendary butty van, recently featured on the Hairy Bikers Go North, which, as it turned out, wasn't there. This was annoying because it's always there, packed in snow in the winter, still smoking at 1:30 on a dark autumn morning, its owners wearing felt antlers on Christmas Day during the pandemic. It's always there with its egg and sausage barn cakes, except for the one occasion when it was supposed to be. We were forced to eat the pork pies that we'd reserved for when we reached Langden Castle before we set off instead. Our adventure, and I'm using the term adventure remarkably loosely here, first took us to the Langden Waterworks, spelled, I'd noticed, with an O rather than an E, and the fact that I'd noticed that gives some indication of how exciting the rest of this episode's going to be. Langden Waterworks owns and operates the water treatment and distribution systems in Langden. Their services also include administration, meter reading, invoicing and water billing services, citation needed. From here the path led us into what appeared to be a set from Jason and the Argonauts, the one where the gods had set up statues of themselves for all the world to see, except without the statues. Two roads diverged on a fell, and I stupidly took the one leading upwards, mistakenly believing there was a memorial to 3 planes that had crashed during World War II up there. It is said, although heavily disputed, that the Pendle Witches took this route on their way to Lancaster. To be hoped they have stronger knees than I have. It's steep around these parts. Fortunately, the council have cobbled the path with large uneven boulders and left some precipitous drops for hikers to fall off when they get bored. Some people reckon that the legendary 14th century Arthurian fable, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, took place along this valley. Well, when I say some people, I mean one bloke called Ron Catterall, to be honest. He wrote an interesting dissertation about it, Langden Castle itself being the mythical green chapel from the medieval poem. That's the sort of stuff that keeps a couple of old fogies like us going against all the odds. By the time we reached about halfway up whatever fell it was we were climbing, we didn't check. We like to live dangerously. We hadn't brought a mobile phone with us, so if we'd have got into any trouble, the Pennine Mountain Rescue Services wouldn't have known about it anyway. Where was I? Oh yes, by the time we'd reached about halfway up, the world had become deathly silent, nobody else being stupid enough to hike so far into such a wilderness. Only the soughing of the wind in the bracken, the creak of Jeannie Mackintosh's girdle, and the distant coughing of sheep could be heard. We couldn't find the memorial, instead we found this circular stone construction, too small to be a pinfold and without adequate drainage to be a pissoir. It was probably a shooting hut once for bored aristocrats to bravely double-barrel savage rabbits and evil cuckoos from. Speaking of fluids, we were thirsty by now. The walk was only 2 miles there and 2 miles back. It should have taken us an hour. 6 hours we were traipsing that valley. 6 bloody hours. At least my vapes were working this time. By my calculations, using Jeannie Mackintosh's head as a gauge, we'd climbed over 50,000 feet. The deeper the purple, the higher the altitude. At which point the path took a sudden unexpected descent into hell. two roads re-met on a fell, and I realised that the missing memorial stone was actually planted at the junction of the two paths, and that we could have taken the lower, much easier on the knees route all along. I blame Jeannie McIntosh, who was too dehydrated and confused by this point to argue. According to said stone, there were 3 separate accidents took place on insert name of fell here. The first by an RAF pilot in 1941, the second by a Canadian pilot in 1942, and the third by a Polish pilot later that same year. Presumably they stopped using the valley as a training ground after that. There were a few scraps of twisted metal around the base of the memorial. Jeannie McIntosh used one to mend the leg of her Zimmer frame, which had taken some damage in a pothole earlier. Onwards we struggled, now using emergency crampons and ropes, our imaginations running riot along the ruined battlements and Disney-esque towers of Langden Castle. And then, finally, a number of hours later and an equal number of stones lighter, Jeannie McIntosh's head now a dangerous shade of dark blue, about 70,000 feet's worth of dulux, I reckoned, we reached our destination. It turned out to be considerably less exciting than we'd anticipated. In fact, the word disappointment would be too weak to describe what was basically an ugly, mud-filled stone hut with a corrugated iron roof, probably the secret drinking hole of some long-forgotten aristocrat. There was the remains of a fireplace inside, if he could claim that this wall-less outhouse actually had an inside. Said fireplace, oddly, didn't match up with the chimney pot on the roof. We've no idea what was housed in the front bit with the unconvincingly arched Gothic windows, the Earl of Langdon's porno mags probably. Jeannie McIntosh found a mouldy old tangerine in her pinafore pocket. We sucked on it for a while, then decided to sue the Ordnance Survey for misrepresentation and started back on the arduous journey to the Trough Road. At one point, we were buzzed by a drone. It was like something from a dystopian sci-fi movie. Somewhere out there on the internet now there's probably pixelated footage of me angrily mooning the camera. Normally at this point I'd ask you to click like and subscribe, but given what we've just witnessed, I wouldn't blame you at all if you don't want to. However, regardless of how bad this film's been, please join us again for the next exciting episode of Lancashire Footnotes and yet another appalling adventure into the unsurprisingly unknown.